What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today we're working on a 2011 Porsche 911S. Today on the 911 behind me, we're going to be covering how to replace your inner and outer tie rods. This job is going to be applicable to your 996 and your 997 chassis, both .1 and .2 for both. Pretty straightforward job. We have a couple kits available on the site. However, today we are working with the TRW kit for the 997.2 behind me. It comes with your inner tie rod, your outer tie rod, as well as a new boot and some Oerlikon clamps and some seals. Typically, these are going to last, it's kind of hard to say, anywhere between 60 to 100,000 miles. It truly depends on the kind of terrain that the car drives on and the kind of driving that you do. There's no real rule of thumb for these. If you think about it, every single time you turn your steering wheel, the ball joint end on the tie rod is working, the spherical end on the inner is working, so they're in constant use. The 911 behind me, as an example, has 64,000 miles. It is a 2011 model, and it's its original tie rod, so there's a little bit of slop in the front end, and it's making alignments a little bit difficult. Also keep in mind, control arms can also have something to do with that. Now that we know what parts we're working with, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this DIY. Today we're going to be using a couple different tools. It may look like a lot, but honestly it's just a couple duplicates of everything. Starting with a 1/2-inch ratchet. We have a torque wrench, a 21mm wrench, a 13mm wrench, a set of Oerlikon clamps, a small set of pliers, a small flathead screwdriver. You can sub this out for any screwdriver as long as it's got some length to it, or a pick. We have a ball joint popper tool. This is CTA 4013. We have a caliper. This is not necessary, but it comes in handy if you want to measure your old tie rods before you put in the new ones, just so you have a rough alignment so you can get the car to the shop. We have two sets of 18mm sockets as well as 19mm sockets. We have a 24mm socket specifically for the ball joint popper tool, so if you're not using that, that does not apply. You have a 5mm hex, which will act as a counter hold for the ball joint end on the tie rod. We're also using this Lyle tool, which is a universal tie rod tool. It comes with different sizes, so you can use it on pretty much any make or model. It's 45/750 for those of you wanting to get one yourselves. And then some nice to haves, but not necessary, is an impact gun. Makes removal of some of the hardware and our wheel a little bit quicker. A paint pen never hurts, especially if you're going to be torquing down your nuts and bolts. And often talked about, but not a necessity, is a little bit of thread locker. Sometimes these inner tie rods don't have a locking washer, so people like to use a little bit of medium strength thread locker to kind of keep it all in place. We're going to be torquing them down to spec and all that good stuff, so that'll just be a bonus. But now that we know what kind of tools we're going to need for this DIY, let's go ahead and get started on this job. All right, my good people, we are at the car. Before we get started, let's just say that this is a job you can do easily in the driveway, in the garage. We're working on the lift today. We're going to start by removing our wheel first. So a 19mm socket to get these 5 lug bolts off. Now with our wheel off, let's go ahead and find our tie rod and see what we're working with. All right, my good people, just a quick tip, trick. You probably know this already, but if you just stick your key in the ignition without turning it, it'll unlock the steering column. That way you can go ahead and rotate your whole assembly as needed. So we have that done already. We're going to go ahead and turn the front right all the way to our right, so we have easy access to our hardware and our tie rod. So before you do anything, the most important thing is you want to break free your locking nut. That way you can use the ball joint being in the knuckle to kind of keep everything from spinning on you. So the air duct here is going to be kind of in the way for this whole video, but we'll work around it. It's just plastic. So now we have a view of what we're going to be working on. The first step is going to be to break free this locking nut. I'm going to use a 21mm wrench. It doesn't hurt if you live in New England like we do to soak this with some PB Blaster or penetrating fluid ahead of time. Now that our locking nut has been freed up, the next step is going to be to remove our nut on the end of our ball joint. The stock hardware, if your vehicle still has stock tie rods, also has a counter hold. It's a Torx versus a hex on the new units. Now to remove this nut, it's going to require an 18mm socket, but just keep in mind sometimes when replacing hardware, especially original hardware, the sizing can change. So on the new TRW ends, The new locking nut is a 19 millimeter, so just keep that in mind. Sometimes you need different sizes. They're not all gonna be the same. I'm gonna use this 18 impact socket on my gun just to zap it off real quickly. If I'm lucky, it'll break free and it'll come off. If not, we'll counter hold with the Torx. I'm gonna use my ball joint popper tool. This will make this tie rod coming out a breeze. Just keep in mind, whenever you use a tool like this, most of the time you're gonna end up damaging the boots. So if you're not planning on replacing the items, just be very careful with your placement. Obviously, these are gonna be replaced today, so we don't really care about what happens to that boot. You wanna make sure you have a good bite on the hardware. You don't want it to be on the end and accidentally slip off. This makes kind of a violent pop when it does its thing. And this is where that 24 millimeter socket will come in handy. Again, on the impact, just to make light work of it. Now that we have our ball joint end off, the next step would be, and this is not necessary, but just makes life a little bit easier for everybody, is to grab a set of calipers, you use a tape measure, a ruler, just to measure the distance between the end of the boot and the start of your lock nut, just to give you a rough idea of what the new tie rod should be set up to. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. So I'm looking at a distance of 57.7 millimeters. Funny enough, that's roughly what the other side was set at. So I'm gonna jot that down, and when we install our new tie rod, I'm gonna make sure that the spacing between the inner and the outer is about the same, 57.7 for us. Now with that done, we can go ahead and continue removing this lock nut. And then I'm going to use a 13 millimeter to counter hold the inner while I free the outer. These are usually stuck on here. So I'm going to grab my 13, spin it the inner a bit so that I have these two flat notches from the outer tie rod available to me. So I can put my 21 millimeter wrench on that. Once it's broken free, you should be able to just go ahead and spin the rest of the outer off. Here's the outer on itself. This is also something you can replace, just the outer versus the inner, but however, we recommend you do them both. If the outer is wasted, the inner is most likely wasted too. You can see there's decent play in our ball joint end and our inner. With this out of the way, I'm gonna go ahead and remove our locking nut just to make my life easier. It's not really in the way of the Lyle tool. However, whatever I can do to make this a smoother DIY. Now that we have our lock nut off, we can go ahead and remove the clamp on the end of our boot. Just using a regular set of pliers to get this off. Our kit comes with a new one, so don't worry if you lose this clamp. Now that we have our outer clamp off, we're working on our inner clamp, which is deep in the abyss. We're using a small flathead screwdriver to kind of break the clamp. They're one-time use, and the kit does come with new ones. You can also replace these clamps with a regular style worm gear clamp, although I don't know how much access you'll have on the install, but usually a 40 to 60 millimeter clamp size will work for that. All right, now with that clamp off, we should be able to pull this boot off. So then grab it somewhere in the middle, give it a good yank. I get it past the notch on the end of it where it holds the end of the boot. And last is this little rubber seal that goes around the rack. Again, our kit comes with a new one of those as well. It's going to look something like that. It's just there to really help seal the elements out of the innards along with the boot. Now with our boot off, we can go ahead and use our Lyle tool to remove our inner tie rod. I went on the other side of the vehicle and I turned the steering wheel left a little bit, almost towards center. The idea being that the end of the rack isn't fully extended. I just think it feels a little bit better if you're going to put some pressure on the end of the rack that it's in the body of the rack itself and it's not fully exposed. That way it doesn't twist and bend as much. Is that actually a thing? I'm not sure, but it makes me feel better. So we're going to take our end of our Lyle tool that fits best on here. I think if you were to put a wrench on this, it's roughly a 32 millimeter, but don't quote me to that. Once you have your crow's foot that you want to use, you take your other end of the Lyle tool and feed it through this ducting. Once we're engaged, lock that bad boy. And then you're going to want to pull it towards you and just make sure it's on there. If it's not turning and you have a good bite, then that means you did it right. So from there, you're going to grab a ratchet. It takes a 1/2 inch drive. So let me grab that. And now with our 1/2-inch drive ratchet, I'm gonna go ahead and get it on the tool. I'm gonna pull the tool towards me, the Lyle tool, while we do this the whole time. Sorry for the view. And then go ahead and break this free. And that should do it. So let's take that ratchet off. Success. Beautiful. Let me get rid of this and we'll pull the rest of that off. And then now we should be able to just twist this off from the tie rod end. With the old tie rod out, we can go ahead and install our new one. We're gonna feed this in by hand and literally just thread it in until it's snug. This is a point where you may or may not want to use a little bit of thread locker. I'm going to do that just because these don't have a locking plate. I'm going to put the babyest dab on the threads and then feed it in. So give me one moment. And just as before, we're going to take our tie rod tool and use it to tighten the inner as well. So I'm going to reach back here and put my crow's foot on. And just for reference, if you're following along at home with the same tools, this one is labeled 1/7/16. With that locked in, we're going to grab our ratchet and snug this back down. If you want to follow along and torque this as well, you're going to want to torque it down to 59 foot-pounds. I'm going to grab my torque wrench, set to 59 foot-pounds, get it started. And similar to removal, I'm going to pull on the tool just to keep tension on it while I tighten this down. Now we just have to remove our Lyle tool, unlock it, pull it out, pull the crow's foot out. And now the next step is going to be putting on the seal on the inner part of the rack that our boot seals up on. We have our new seal, so you can see it's nice and even, a little bit tighter than the old one, so we're going to have to stretch it around the rack. I'm going to use a flathead screwdriver to aid as an extra finger, if you will, so I'll show you how to do that. Slip it over the end of the threaded end, get it over our axial joint, and then the tricky part is, because it's so new and tight, it's honestly just feeding it over the rack. I'm going to use a flathead screwdriver as a helping hand and kind of feed it forward, if that makes sense. So I'm going to start at the tip of the screwdriver, get it started, and then feed the rest of the seal while pushing the screwdriver forward if possible. Doesn't always work very well. You have the mounting points of the rack in the way, but once that's on, our next step is going to be to slide our boot in with the Oerlikon clamp on the end of it. And let's do that. Now we have our new boot. We have our new inner clamp. In my experience, it's easiest to put the clamp on the boot before you feed it in, just because it's such a tough spot to reach in there. And you always want to keep these kind of pre-assembled if possible when working on an Oerlikon style clamp. So it's going to look something like that. We're going to go ahead and feed it over our new seal at the end of the steering rack. I'm going to go ahead and slide it on. Just another quick tip, you can see we haven't changed how much of the tie rod is still sticking out. By that I mean we haven't turned the wheel on the other side. So you could almost turn the car full left or full right, depending on what side you're working on, full lock, so that the length of the boot itself gets shortened. Just helps kind of install things. I'll show you what I mean in a little bit if we run into that issue here. So right now, I was able to push it on and get it on most of the way. What I'm going to do right now is run to the other side of the vehicle. We're working on the passenger side. Run to the left side and turn the steering wheel, or the wheel, whichever I can get access to, a little bit left. And it'll kind of compress this even more. It'll allow the end of the boot to sink on. So give me one sec. I'll show you what I mean by the opposite way. You can see the boot is going to expand. So you can always turn it left and give yourself a little bit of a cheat code. Our boot is fully on. The next tricky step is going to be to hold the clamp with one hand while we grab our Oerlikon clamps and crimp down that end. So let me show you how that's going to look. I got these Knips Oerlikon style clamps. Thank you, Gareth. Part number on these is 1099-1220. I don't think I mentioned that at the beginning. But what's cool about these is that you can do a normal style clamp from above or from the side if you have room. But these also have a side clamp that will allow you to go in at a horizontal level and crimp this way, because we won't be able to go up from underneath like this or from up above. So these are really cool. You can go in from the side. I'm going to see if removing this plastic clip to free this line up a little bit might give me some room to fully open my pliers up. We finally fought the struggle. We got the clamp on. The move was to remove the plastic rivet that holds this line in place, and it gives you enough room to get the Oetiker clamps in there. So before I forget, I'm going to put this plastic rivet back in so this can go back in its home, and then we'll continue installing our clamps and our outer tie rod. To make my life a little bit easier, like I mentioned earlier, you can turn the wheel left and right if the steering column's unlocked. I'm going to turn it back towards the right so that I have more of the tie rod end towards me, and I can easily add my other clamp, my lock nut. So let's go ahead and do that. Now that our inner clamp is on, we can go ahead and install our outer. You can see there's still part of the notch here where this boot is supposed to sit. So you can always just pull it forward a little bit, get it on there nice and snug. Once you have that on, you can take your clamp, slide it on, grab your pliers or your clamp tool. Now we can take our lock nut and get it started. And while I have you in this view, we're going to roughly set it to the 57.7 millimeter distance we got off the old tie rod, which was in between the boot and the locking nut. So again, this isn't going to be perfect. This is a really raw way of doing it, but it is just enough to get you to the alignment shop and not destroy your tires on the whole way there. So you can see I'm at 57.3 roughly. I'm gonna bring it back a little bit. We're gonna like 57.65 is fine. We're gonna have to account for the lock nut actually doing its job and turning another thread or two, so that'll be okay. Now we can go ahead and take the rest of our tie rod end and get it started. Now we can go ahead and install our ball joint end back into our wheel carrier. We're going to go ahead and just get it started by hand and thread our 19 millimeter bolt on. So if you remember at the beginning I mentioned that the old hardware used an 18 mil, the OE factory hardware. The new one from TRW uses a 19 mil. So there's a couple things you can do here. At this point you can go ahead and counter hold with a 5 millimeter hex and use a 19 millimeter wrench or ratchet, whatever way you have set up to tighten this down. And if you're working on the garage floor or your driveway, another thing you can do is take a floor jack and jack up on the tie rod end itself so that the tapered end locks into the wheel carrier and hopefully keeps the stud from spinning. Sometimes you can just use your hand in an impact to recreate that. I'm going to give that a shot first. If not, we'll grab the counter hold tool and we'll do it the other way. So again, 19 millimeter socket for this, or wrench. And I'm just going to push up with my right hand, use the impact to snug it in quickly, and then we're going to go ahead and torque it down to 56 foot-pounds. Beautiful. I'm going to use a little paint marker just to mark it. Always keep an eye on it, make sure it doesn't come undone, but there's no reason it should. And now all we have left is to secure our lock nut to the end of our tie rod end. So button it up by hand, grab your 21 millimeter wrench. That should be good. It's going to go for an alignment right after this video anyways, so it's not going to take too much force, and they're going to undo it again just so they can do the alignment properly. Now let's go ahead and get our wheel reinstalled. And now we'll lower the car down and torque our wheel down. We're going to go ahead and torque these down to 90 foot-pounds. And there you have it, my good people, another DIY in the books. Overall, a pretty straightforward process. As we mentioned at the beginning, this DIY is applicable to both your 996 and 997 vehicles. It's the same process. Today we worked on the passenger side of the 911. The driver's side is going to be identical. Only thing I would argue is that you have a little bit more room on the driver's side to use your Oetiker clamps without having to remove any surrounding parts. On the passenger side, we did have to free up that line just to give us the right angle and a little bit of more spread on those clamps. Overall, an easy job. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave them in the comment box below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.